Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Um, Today, we are going to talk about the future of nuclear energy, but with it kind of a pivot toward the Arab world, and we will understand why during the discussion, and that's why we chose the title "The Future of Nuclear Energy." um, the role of the Arab world and the impact on uranium and thorium markets. With us today is Justin Hune, the publisher of the Uranium Insider, which is an investing newsletter, an amazing newsletter, and you'll hear about it later on. With us also Thomas Jam Pedersen, who is the founder of the Copenhagen Atomics, and we will know what they do in a few minutes. And of course, we have Eric Townsend, who is known to many of you who are especially in oil and gas. He is the publisher of the Energy Transition Crisis docu-series. And of course, you know him from the Macro Voices podcast. He is the host of that podcast. Today's space is sponsored by Ataka. Ataka is the only energy focused media outlet in Arabic language. And the they, of course, just like any other media outlet, focus on all types of news, but they also focus on reports, data analysis, etc. But since it is in Arabic, I would like to mention or reiterate for those who do not know that when you see me retweeting or tweeting in Arabic, please use that translation function in Twitter, which is on the bottom left of any tweet, and you get it in whatever language your browser is in. So if you see things in Arabic, just don't ignore it because there is a lot of information that's not in English or other languages. Again, thank you all for joining us, and please make sure you follow everyone on the list of the speakers and also Ataqa. Um, it's become clear that the renaissance in nuclear energy is upon us. The evidence is everywhere, from uranium prices more than doubling in the last year to 25 nations signing an accord at the recent COP28, which was held in Dubai, to triple nuclear energy capacity by 2050. Let me repeat that, to triple nuclear energy capacity by 2050. We are talking about 25 years, the next 25 years. Since many of our listeners are investors who want to get on the profit being made in nuclear energy, I want to start with Justin, since he writes a newsletter that aims to inform investors of the best trading opportunities in nuclear energy in today's public markets. Justin, thank you for joining us today. The spot price of uranium has more than tripled in the last few years. Your newsletter has made an amazing 500% for your subscribers since inception in 2019. So clearly, you understand this market. What is driving this rally? Will it last? How long it will continue? And is it too late to invest, or we are still at the beginning? So how can everyone benefit from what's going on right now and from this tripling of the nuclear capacity by 2050? Justin?
Thank you so much for having me, Anas. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to be on this panel today and discuss the exciting elements of the future of nuclear and the investing opportunities as well. I completely agree with you. A nuclear renaissance is upon us right now, and this could be decades in the making. It is decades in the making, and it could last for decades going forward. We're so early in the story that there really aren't very many good investment plays on nuclear energy technology. Even they don't even exist yet in public markets. The most exciting investment opportunities are likely to be coming from companies that are pioneering advanced nuclear technologies that will make nuclear even safer and more cost effective than it is today. So I'm really excited to hear what Thomas Jam and Eric have to say about the future of nuclear, in terms of advanced nuclear and where these new investments will be found in the future here. But returning to the here and now, the primary trading opportunity is in uranium itself. This is the commodity that fuels the existing global nuclear reactor fleet of light water, boiling water, heavy water reactors. And to be clear, the bull market in uranium is already underway. This is being driven by the demand from the existing conventional fleet. This is not pricing in whatsoever the tripling of nuclear, like you mentioned, the proclamation at the recent COP conference, or a small modular reactors, advanced reactors. There's a very small amount of demand that's being priced in currently, and I would argue probably none. The existing setup here is based on the already existing fleet and perhaps the grid connections that we're going to see in the coming years. The current supply and demand dynamic is exactly why we expect higher uranium prices. We have currently about approximately 180 million pounds of demand of uranium per year by the global nuclear reactor fleet. And we have a primary supply of mined uranium of about 140 to 150 million pounds. There's other elements with secondary demand coming from financials and inventory buildouts, secondary supply coming from enrichment underfeeding. But without getting into the weeds there, just to put it bluntly, we have 30 to 50 million pound per year supply deficit currently that is going to last at least 3 to 5 years going forward. So this has almost nothing to do with the future and the exciting future of advanced nuclear and this nuclear renaissance we're all discussing today. It's just the existing fleet and the absolutely necessary commodity that powers that fleet. China right now is building more reactors than anybody else. They have 26 large reactors under construction currently, right now. They have 55 gigawatts of nuclear. They're aiming for 150 gigawatts in 10 years by 2035. So if we include the 26 under construction, they're going to need another about 65 reactors in the next 10 years, which is phenomenal. However, on the supply side, the new large mines are many years away. We're just starting to kind of see the gears turning of supply responding to this high price environment. So we're currently right now at just over $100 a pound uranium. We were bottoming out at below $18 a pound in 2016. The price peaked out at $134 a pound in 2007. So historically speaking, the commodity goes in these very, very steep and very wild price swings. And we think we're in the early stages of what we're going to see is multiple years of a sustained higher price uranium environment, which is, in my opinion, absolutely necessary to incentivize production and supply to come online to even hope to hit these targets that we're discussing here. So we have a couple of large mines that, one primarily in Saskatchewan, Canada, is at least 3 or 4 years away from producing first material. We've got some care and maintenance mines coming online, but long story short, it just takes a very, very long time to bring supply online, and it's going to be multiple years of a sustained deficit out in front of us here. The existing producers that are aiming to ramp production also takes time. The primary producer of uranium in the world is Kazakhstan. They are talking about increasing their supply pretty substantially. And as we just heard over the past 6 weeks from the company, that their supply targets for this year and next year are not going to be hit. And it's just going to take even more time for this huge producer of uranium to reach these production targets. So while this renaissance we're discussing today is super exciting, holds great promise for the hopefully near future, the demand of the existing fleet, the reactors under construction that will be grid connected in the coming years will outpace supply and will lead to a persisting higher uranium price. And of course, the primary way to invest in that currently is through the uranium mining companies. There's only a small handful that are actually producing right now. There's maybe a dozen companies that are moving towards production in the development stage. Again, all of these projects take a very long time and a lot of money to bring online. You have a couple of primary ETFs. That would be the Global X Uranium ETF, URA. that is 70% allocated to uranium. It does have good liquidity and has the deepest options market. You also have the Sprott Uranium Miners ETF, or URNM, which is 100% allocated to the sector. Those are good ways for anyone who doesn't want to dig deeper into the individual companies to have exposure to the sector. In closing, really, Anas here, the reason we're focusing on investing in the fuel rather than the long-term build-out of more nuclear power plants is simply that there's those more strategic investments in the coming nuclear renaissance. They just don't exist yet in public markets. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Eric and Thomas Jam see on the horizon with respect to which advanced nuclear technologies will define the coming renaissance and which companies will develop and profit from those technologies.
Thank you, Justin. Please follow Justin, and for those who are interested, and especially in investing in ETFs or stocks, you might want to subscribe to his newsletter. Um, I would like to take this opportunity just to mention that Twitter is still having some problems. So in case we got disconnected, we will get back. So please come back with us. Uh, Eric, this question is for you. You are the big picture thinker on today's call. Your work is not just on nuclear energy, but more broadly on energy transition, and you publish those videos and other things all about the energy transition and the role of nuclear in it. Uh, so, what did you make of this triple nuclear at COP2, or the announcement at COP28? And what is your vision for where the nuclear renaissance is headed overall?
Anas,
Eric?
thanks so much for inviting me on this Spaces. I've really enjoyed having you on Macro Voices, and it's great to be on the other side of the microphone, so to speak. So the triple nuclear announcement at COP28 was super important for three reasons. The first one is obvious. Nuclear energy has always been the most suitable baseload electricity source for energy transition. And now we're finally seeing Western governments begin to overcome their irrational preoccupation with wind and solar and committing to making the needed investment to embrace and expand nuclear power, which, unlike wind and solar, really can solve energy transition and climate change. But I think the second reason is actually more important. It happened at a climate conference. Just a couple of years ago, anybody who so much as mentioned nuclear energy at an environmental conference would have been booed out of the room. But now the climate and environmental communities have finally recognized that nuclear energy is the only sane way to navigate energy transition and solve climate change. The effect of having the triple nuclear pledge announced at the COP28 event, I think, was effectively to send the message to the institutional investment community globally and basically tell them, okay, guys, nuclear energy is no longer on the ESG blacklist. You're allowed to invest in nuclear now. The third reason that the triple nuclear pledge was so important was because of what it reveals, to my mind at least, about how far we still have to go to educate the policymakers about nuclear energy and how it works. Triple nuclear what? What kind of nuclear energy? Based on which generation of nuclear reactors and using which nuclear fuel? Conventional nuclear or generation four? Water cooled, gas cooled, sodium cooled, molten salt cooled? These are important questions. So, which kind of nuclear energy gets deployed to fulfill this pledge is going to be even more important than the pledge to triple nuclear capacity itself. And that's why I think it's so important for policymakers to learn more about advanced nuclear technology. There's a sea of difference between the 1950s technology, light water reactors that are used in most of today's nuclear power plants, versus advanced Generation 4 designs, such as the reactor that Thomas Jam's company is already developing. And the benefits of the newer technologies are critical to understand in order to make informed policy decisions. Back to you, Anas.
Thanks, Eric. I think I do have another question for you here. I am definitely looking forward to hearing all about these new reactors from Thomas Jam and what his company is producing. And we will get there in a few minutes. But again, Eric, I want to set some context here. Most of our listeners, mainly because of my followers, are somehow expert in energy. They know about energy in general, but most of them are really in oil and gas and may not know or have a strong background in nuclear energy specifically. So I would like to ask you to give us a brief introduction to how nuclear power was originally developed, why it's so important to understand that not all nuclear reactors are created equal. I think this historical background will be or will nicely set the stage for the rest of this space. Eric?
Sure. Well, I came to this. I've only been learning about nuclear in the last few years, coming to it from having been an oil trader. So I guess I have a bit in common with most of the audience. The executive summary is that exactly as you just said, not all nuclear reactors are created equal. And the West is still building reactors based on outdated technology that's not particularly well suited to solving energy transition. But China has recently made terrific strides in adopting much better, safer, advanced reactor designs. So China's in the lead on nuclear by a lot. And in my opinion, the bureaucracy of Western governments is preventing the West from competing as it should with China. This is a really big deal to my thinking because unless we change our ways and catch up with the latest reactor technology, China's going to control energy for the next 100 years. To understand this picture requires first understanding the history of how the industry got to be where it is. So I'll try and give you the most concise history that I can. The most important research that occurred was during the Manhattan Project. The goal of the US military was to get the nuclear bomb before the Nazis did in order to win World War II. Period. End of story. That's all they cared about. Civilian nuclear energy was never even a goal. To make an atomic bomb, you need weapons grade fissile material. There were only three radioactive isotype. There were only three radioactive isotopes that could realistically be purified or manufactured to weapons grade. Those three possible sources of fissile isotopes that could be used for bomb making were plutonium 239, uranium 233, and uranium 235. So a big project was undertaken in Hanford, Washington to manufacture plutonium 239, while a second big project was commissioned at Oak Ridge, Tennessee to enrich natural uranium that's mined out of the ground into weapons grade uranium 235. The remaining candidate was uranium 233, another isotope of uranium which could theoretically be used to make a bomb. But uranium 233 doesn't occur naturally. It has to be bred from another element called thorium 232 using a special kind of nuclear reactor. The research scientists quickly realized that it would be much more difficult and expensive to make a bomb from relatively unstable uranium 233 than from plutonium 239 or uranium 235. So the Manhattan Project summarily rejected both uranium 233 and the thorium that's used to produce it from consideration entirely. They focused instead solely on the other two isotopes, which were far more suitable for bomb making. Now, I'll explain what all of this has to do with civilian nuclear energy today in just a minute. Both of those projects were successful. The Hiroshima bomb was made from highly enriched uranium that was produced at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, while the Nagasaki bomb was made from the plutonium that was produced in Hanford. Once World War II was over and the Cold War was starting, the military suddenly discovered its own need for nuclear power in addition to nuclear weapons. That happened when Admiral Hyman Rickover made the argument for a nuclear-powered submarine that could stay submerged almost indefinitely and which could be armed with submarine-launched nuclear missiles that could never be disabled by an enemy first strike. So in pursuit of nuclear submarine propulsion, electricity, or the generation of electricity from a nuclear reactor, was first demonstrated in a US government research laboratory back in 1951. The Nautilus submarine entered service just 4 years later in 1955. It used a brand new reactor design called the Pressurized Light Water Reactor. That reactor was designed by Alvin Weinberg, who would later emphasize in his autobiography written in 1997 that the pressurized light water reactor was chosen solely because it was most able to fit into the cramped space available inside the hull of a submarine. When civilian nuclear energy was later contemplated, a decision was made to base all civilian nuclear electric generation on the same light water reactor design that had already been proven to work for submarine propulsion. Now, this next point is really important to understand. That decision to standardize on the light water reactor design for civilian nuclear energy was made by bureaucrats, not by scientists and engineers. And the logic behind it was very simple. It was just that it had been proven to work in submarines, so they figured that it made sense to use what's known to work rather than spend any more money and time considering other designs. So contrary to popular misconception today, the choice of the light water reactor design for civilian nuclear power was not made after any kind of competition between reactor designs based on merit as evaluated by scientists and engineers. Weinberg was emphatic on that point in his book written in 1997. By 1958, just 7 years after the first laboratory demonstration of electricity from nuclear power, they already had plenty of experience operating these light water reactors. And they'd already figured out that the worst safety risks were fuel rod meltdowns and hydrogen explosions, like the ones that blew the roofs off the reactor buildings in Fukushima 53 years later. So they knew way back in 1958 that the whole problem that was causing these safety risks was the choice of water as the reactor core coolant. So the molten salt reactor experiment was commissioned in 1958 to explore a better reactor design that would overcome the inherent safety problems associated with water-cooled reactors. Alvin Weinberg, the inventor of the pressurized light water reactor, was by then in charge of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So the entire molten salt reactor experiment was under Weinberg's leadership. To put this in perspective, more than 20 years before the 3 Mile Island accident occurred, Weinberg's team correctly predicted that fuel rod meltdowns and hydrogen explosions were going to be a major risk for civilian nuclear power. So they set out to solve that problem before the first accident ever had a chance to happen. They succeeded in solving the problem by the late 1960s, but sadly, those solutions were never adopted and commercialized and put into service before those accidents actually occurred. The first molten salt reactor was built in 1964 at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and it completely eliminated the risks of fuel rod meltdowns and hydrogen explosions. And it was fueled by thorium rather than uranium-235. Now, this point is super important. Stepping back to the bigger picture, nuclear energy would eventually face massive public opposition due to the risks of nuclear weapons proliferation. Everybody was afraid that nuclear power plants might somehow be misused in order to make more weapons-grade fissile materials for bomb making. Remember how I explained earlier that the Manhattan Project had summarily dismissed uranium-233 and thorium-232 as a complete waste of time because even the Manhattan Project scientists thought that building a bomb out of U-233 was going to be so difficult to the point that it would become impractical? Well, what could possibly be better than a reactor that's designed based on a nuclear fuel that had been rejected by the Manhattan Project precisely because they thought that making a bomb from it would be so difficult as to be impractical, even for their very talented teams. Well, the experimental molten salt reactor was fueled with thorium rather than uranium, precisely because Alvin Weinberg saw the weapons proliferation debate coming. And he recognized the need for civilian power reactors that couldn't possibly be repurposed for bomb making. It's truly remarkable that Weinberg and his team in Oak Ridge had such amazing prescience way back in 1964. Thorium-fueled reactors were never commercialized, though, until very recently, when China began building them using the same research from Oak Ridge, which Weinberg and his team developed in the 1960s. In 2018, China began building its first thorium-fueled molten salt reactor in the middle of the Gobi Desert. They did that to demonstrate the fact that molten salt reactors, unlike light water reactors, can be built in the middle of the desert. They don't have to be next to a river or ocean for the sake of having access to cooling water. In December of 2023, China announced that it would build container ships powered by thorium-fueled molten salt reactors, making the first or marking the first long overdue commercialization of this advanced reactor design. So why hasn't this far superior design been commercialized in the West? Because the bureaucrats in charge of the US nuclear program knew that the esteemed Manhattan Project had already made the determination that thorium and uranium 233 were a complete dead end and a waste of time, and that decision had already been made to standardize on the light water reactor design for civilian nuclear power. Well, but wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Thorium and uranium 233 are a dead end if your goal is to make a bomb. But if your goal is to prevent anyone from repurposing a civilian power reactor to try and make a bomb with it, then thorium and uranium 233 are the ideal choice precisely because they're so poorly suited to bomb making. Now, Weinberg and his team at Oak Ridge understood all of this back in the early 1960s. Yet molten salt reactors were never commercialized in the West. And Weinberg would later exclaim in his 1997 autobiography that he thought that abandoning molten salt and thorium was one of the greatest tragedies of the first nuclear era. So far as I can tell, to this day, the problem is simply that the bureaucrats in charge are still stuck on this very simplistic message that the Manhattan Project already determined that thorium and uranium 233 were a dead end and a waste of time. Obviously, they're missing the point rather badly. So clearly, to solve energy transition, we ought to be looking at the very best reactor designs available. And that's exactly what China is already doing with great success. And the crazy thing is, in China's search for the very best 21st century reactor design, they ended up choosing Weinberg's thorium molten salt breeder reactor, which was designed way back in the 1960s, the same one that Weinberg thought should have been commercialized by the United States back in the 1970s. But what's truly amazing is that to this day, the outdated 1950s pressurized light water reactor and its close cousin, the boiling water reactor, are still used by almost all civilian nuclear power stations built in the West. Not just existing power plants, but in proposed new construction power plants as well. And what's worse, there's a widespread perception in the nuclear power industry that the pressurized light water reactor design was carefully chosen after a close evaluation of all of the available designs, and that only after that careful evaluation based on merit, it was scientists and engineers who decided that the light water reactor designs were the best choice for civilian nuclear energy. They actually teach that propaganda in Western nuclear engineering university programs, despite the fact that the inventor of the pressurized light water reactor clearly debunked these myths in his book, which is called The First Nuclear Era. It's a terrific book. I highly recommend reading it. So, light water reactors also waste 95% of the uranium fuel that they consume. And the direct result of that waste is that the world has now amassed 250,000 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel waste. Advanced reactor designs can use almost all the uranium fuel with much less waste. And really advanced reactors, like the one Thomas Jam is developing, can even burn up the waste that's left over from the reactors of yesteryear and use that waste as fuel to power new reactors. China is building advanced reactors that do all these things. But we in the West are still stuck on light water reactors that are based on outdated 1950s technology. Again, according to Alvin Weinberg, the guy who invented the pressurized light water reactor, it was chosen because it fit in the hull of the Nautilus submarine. And then it was standardized for civilian power reactor because it was proven to work in the submarine. End of story. Nothing more to it than that. But whatever became of the thorium-fueled molten salt reactor that was designed in the 1960s by Weinberg's team at Oak Ridge? Well, that's the design that I mentioned earlier that eliminates fuel rod meltdowns and hydrogen explosion risks, the exact problems that would later cause the 3 Mile Island accident, the Chernobyl accident, and the Fukushima accidents. Well, whatever became of that reactor design that solved all those problems and which uses thorium instead of uranium as its fuel? China recognized and embraced the value of this design and has already announced its plans to use it to power container ships. But sadly, most of the Western nuclear power industry continues to ignore this far superior design because Western regulators don't understand it. And because the US Nuclear Regulatory Agency is such a colossal bureaucracy that most experts agree that there's little chance they would ever approve a thorium fueled uh, molten salt reactor for civilian power generation, unless it was some massive change in the government where the president decreed that there had to be more priority on adoption of nuclear, advanced nuclear designs or something like that. So just in the past few years, we're starting to see rays of hope, I would say, in the West. A small cottage industry is finally starting to form, and more than a dozen startup companies around the world are working right now to catch up with China on the commercialization of thorium-fueled molten salt reactors, which were first designed and pioneered, 50 years ago back in Oak Ridge in the 1960s. But they face an uphill battle persuading Western regulators to approve such advanced designs. And because of that resistance, that makes institutional investors extremely hesitant to invest in these startup companies. Now, I don't want to steal Thomas Jam's thunder, so I'm going to leave it to him to tell the rest of the thorium and molten salt story, since his company is one of the leaders in this formative new cottage industry. The real point that I want to make to our listeners is that when policymakers talk about tripling nuclear energy by 2050, it's incredibly important to ask what kind of nuclear reactors they're going to build. The stage is presently set to focus mainly on building more outdated 1950s technology, conventional light water reactors, despite the fact that the guy who invented them clearly thought that we should have moved on to far superior advanced reactor designs decades ago. Now, China understands all of this better than anyone, and they've already taken a massive lead over the West. They've already built a thorium fueled molten salt reactor in the middle of the Gobi Desert based on Weinberg's design from Oak Ridge back in the 1960s. They've already announced their plans to build container ships powered by thorium fueled molten salt reactors. And they've already built some very advanced high temperature gas cooled reactors, which are particularly well suited to hydrogen production. Hydrogen production is super important because it's critical to solving the liquid fuels problem in energy transition. So China's leadership gets it in spades, and they deserve to be complimented for their exceptional progress in the last few years. Now, the most important reason that we should focus on advanced rather than conventional nuclear technology is to reduce the cost of nuclear energy. Honest, I would love to say more about that issue of cost of nuclear energy before this spaces is over, but I also realize that I've probably consumed more time than I was supposed to just on the history of nuclear power. So I'll let you move on. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Mentioning those dates made many of us basically feel young. So thank you. Uh, I just have a very quick question for you, since you raised this issue. Do you think changing the name of those new reactors or the whole industry of nuclear reactors for power generation, taking the name of nuclear out, make it more acceptable to the public?
That was one of the very first ideas that I had when I came into this is we need a new name. We should get rid of the word nuclear and atomic and stop scaring the public with that. We should call it smart fission or unlimited thorium energy or something like that. The problem is that the bureaucratic regulatory structure in the West has actually codified into law that you cannot change the name. If you're going to have any kind of nuclear chain reaction, I think there's probably Thomas Jam would know better than I would, but I think there's actually a law on the books in the United States that says you're not allowed to change the name. You have to call it nuclear in order to be able to use this kind of technology. I definitely agree with you, though. That law should be repealed. We should change the name, and we really should communicate somehow to the general public that, look, we do recognize that it's a mistake to build nuclear reactors that are capable, under any circumstance, of having fuel rods melt down, as happened in Fukushima. There is technology that eliminates all those risks and that could deliver us a much safer kind of technology, and it ought to have a different name. But I'm pretty sure there's actually a law preventing that right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thomas Jan Pedersen, we are really pleased to have you in this space today. You are the founder of the Copenhagen Atomics, a company that already building thorium fueled, molten salt cooled, advanced nuclear reactor. And probably, Eric, we even those names we need to shorten them. Kind of they are too long too. So they are the type, the kind Eric says we should be focusing on for the energy transition rather than the established industry standard pressurized water design. Eric already gave us the historical perspective that this reactor design was pioneered by the same guy who invented the pressurized light water reactor. So now I want to hear the present tense, the 2024 version of this story. So Eric told us about the history until now. Now we are in 2024. So where we are right now. So you are running a company that hopes to kind of make a revolution in nuclear energy. We always talk here in the United States, in Texas, we talk about the shale revolution. So probably now we will have another revolution in nuclear. So you are running a company that hopes to cause this revolution. So please tell us about it. Or what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Is Eric right that China already has a big lead over the Western countries? And if so, what should we do to make sure we catch up with China? Thomas, please.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this show, Anas. And I'm very honored to be on a show with such knowledgeable people as Eric and Justin. They gave a lot of background for this whole the industry and also the transition of nuclear energy. So I came into this around 15 years ago. I was already working in the energy sector, but I had been studying prior to this other technologies, energy storage and fusion, for example. And I decided not to invest in those. And then as I was looking into nuclear, I came across an article about thorium energy. And to be honest, when the first article I saw, it said that a ball the size of a golf ball made out of thorium can supply you with all the energy you need for your entire life, not just electricity at home, but also your share of all the products you need throughout your life, all the transportation, and your share of roads and houses and hospitals. And I also read in that first article that this small golf ball of thorium only costs roughly $100 to mine out of the ground. And I just, to be honest, I didn't believe it. I thought it was too good to be true. And in the first instant, I sort of put it away and went on in my life in other directions. But it kept on coming back and haunting me, and eventually I had to sort of look into it some more. In one evening, I sat down and made the calculation to see, is it really true that there's all this energy in one golf ball sized lump of thorium? And it only took 10 minutes or something like that, and I realized it is actually true. The physics is true. So then I started wondering, why are we not using it? I mean, we need all this energy, and here's something that seemed to be much better than the traditional nuclear energy that Eric explained from uranium. And so I started going to international conferences about thorium energy and trying to figure out how you make a machine that can convert thorium into energy, because that's sort of what is needed. You need some kind of machine. And by then I've already found out that lots of people have tried to put thorium in traditional classical reactors, the pressurized light water reactors and other types of solid fuel reactors, and when you put thorium in those reactors, there's not really any benefit. It doesn't perform better than uranium, and this is some of the things that I learned within the first couple of years that I started studying this. And I realized that there was already this concept of molten salt reactors that had been developed by Alvin Weinberg back in the 60s, and it was actually tested. So we knew that it kind of worked. I mean, he never got to a commercial reactor, but he did prove the most important points about molten salt reactors and how they work. He was not able to run sort of a fully functioning thorium reactor. So his reactor was still started on uranium, but he did show some of the capabilities of running with uranium-233. So all of that was clear. And long story short, then I met some other guys who also wanted to learn about thorium energy. And in the beginning, we called it thorium energy exactly to sort of distance us from traditional nuclear. But Eric is right that all the approvals you need and all the supply chains you need to get access to, they are deeply ingrained in the traditional nuclear industry, and also so it's. I mean, you can market it towards the greater public that it's something different, but when you go to the governments and need to get approvals and everything, you still need to work with the traditional nuclear industry and all the regulations that are faced there. But long story short, so we started a company because we realized that you can make a thorium-based molten salt reactor, and it can be much more efficient than any other solid fuel reactor we have built in the world until this day. Molten salt reactors has sort of a huge advantage. It's a little bit like comparing a horse carriage and an airplane. I mean, even though both of them are transportation devices, I don't think anyone sort of put them in the same category inside their own head. And the same should be true for classical light water reactors and thorium molten salt reactors. I mean, they are really two completely different categories, but both of them rely on fissioning heavy uranium elements. And now I want to explain a little bit what it is we're trying to achieve in Copenhagen Atomics. So first of all, when we started the company, we said, okay, we really would like to make a big difference in the world in terms of making a new energy source available that can scale. And when I say scale, it's something that should, within 50 years, it should be able to go to the same amounts of energy supply as oil or gas, which are some of the big suppliers today. And when you look at the traditional nuclear industry light water reactors, it's simply impossible to fathom how those technologies could ever scale to provide amounts of energy that are similar to oil and gas. So we need something new, and we realized that this thorium molten salt reactor is the only technology that can do this. I even doubt that fusion can do that, but that's sort of a little bit off topic for today. But molten salt reactors, we realized that can really scale. So we started a company back in 2014, and right from the get-go, we said we want to mass manufacture these thorium reactors. We want to make at least one reactor every day. And I can tell you, everybody back then, this is 10 years ago, everybody told us we were crazy and we should go to the doctor. I mean, they said, the nuclear reactors take 10 years to build. It's impossible to build one every day. But that's not true, because our reactor is actually much smaller than a traditional light water reactor. Our reactor fits inside roughly the same footprint as a 40-foot shipping container, and it delivers 100 megawatt of thermal energy in that footprint. And the amount of components that go into assembling that reactor is less than in a modern car. And we make 100,000 cars every day. We can easily make one reactor every day. Of course, the component for that is coming from sub-suppliers. So it's not like everything is built in one single factory. It's the same as when we build cars. The components are made from a lot of different sub-suppliers. We already do that today in Copenhagen Atomics. And then we get them here to our factory located very close to the airport of Copenhagen. And then we assemble all these components, and then we have to do a lot of testing. So right now, we are in the process of building the first reactors. These first prototypes that we're building right close to where I'm sitting now, they will not be approved to start a nuclear chain reaction, because we need to do a lot of testing and prove some of the technologies, some of the all the pumps and heat exchangers and thermal expansion and chemistry and all these different things that go into a reactor like this. But in a couple of years from now, we will build sort of the first test reactor that is going to start in 2026. So that is the target year for us to prove that we as a company are able to build these reactors. But of course, that reactor is not very different from the reactor that Alvin Weinberg and his team built back in Oak Ridge in the 1960s. So that's the first step in our evolution. And then once we have shown that we can build a small test reactor and get that up and running, then we will move on to build commercial reactors. Both the test reactor and the commercial reactors are the same footprint. They're all in this size of a 40-foot shipping container. And we've already proven that they can be built quite quickly. And we are 100% sure that we can build one every day once we get up to scale. But the big problem for us is not building them in a factory. The big problem is to get all the paperwork and all the approvals to actually install one reactor every day. If you know how much time it takes to just get an approval to build a wind farm or a solar farm or something, or even worse, all the number of years it takes to get an approval to build a traditional nuclear reactor that we've seen in the US and in Finland, and also now with Hinkley Point C in the UK, that typically it takes 10 years or sometimes more than 10 years to build these reactors. And most of that time is not building. It's all the approvals and all the meetings and all the bureaucracy around building a nuclear reactor. So that's another really, really important thing for our company, is to figure out a way to bring that bureaucracy down so that we can actually install one reactor every day. And of course, we're also working on that. But I have to be honest and say that we still get sort of not giant amounts of investment. So we focus 90% of those investments to get the first reactor up and running by 2026. And I'm fairly confident that that will happen. And then for now, we only spend a small amount of the resources on figuring out how to get to figure out how to install one reactor every day. But one of the things that we think will make this possible is if you look at electricity in the whole world, it's something between 15 and 18% of global energy supply is electricity. So the other, you could say 82% or more of global energy supply is all the other stuff that is not electricity. That's transportation, that's all the mining, that's all the making of steel and concrete and aluminium and ammonia and all these other commodities. And of course, it's transportation and production of all the products and so on. All of that happens by far, not entirely, but mostly with coal and oil and gas. And of course, that is a much bigger market than the electricity market. And we believe that our reactor is actually perfect for installation at large industrial sites or for large commodity production, such as ammonia or aluminium, or at mining sites that need huge amount of energy for the mining and the grinding grinding the rocks down to powder, and also the chemistry and the smelting. So those are large installations, typically far away from big cities, where they need, in some cases, some of the companies we talk to need more than 1,000 reactors in one site. So this is a way for us to find customers where we can maybe spend a couple of years to get the approvals needed to install the reactors. But then after that, we can install a large number of reactors at single sites. That's sort of the way we want to get this going. And then eventually, of course, we would like to be able to install these reactors sort of more distributed, so that we can install 1 or 2 reactors at smaller sites, and also help grow the grid applications in places like Africa, where they really, really need electricity like crazy. and where they pay a huge price for electricity today. That's just one example, but there are many places around the world where they could really benefit from having our type of reactor. And then the final thing I want to mention is that what makes us really proud in Copenhagen Atomics is that we've found a way to reduce the price of nuclear energy. You probably know that if you look at all the other nuclear, sort of classical nuclear reactors, but also some of the advanced nuclear reactors, they are talking about prices from $60 per megawatt hour up to $120 per megawatt hour. Those are very typical prices from different types of reactor designs that is proposed to be installed for grid applications in the West. But for our reactor, we are aiming to reach $20 per megawatt hour by 2035. So it's a radically different price point than traditional nuclear energy. And the reason why we can get the price down so far is because we use thorium and molten salt reactors. This would be entirely impossible if we didn't have those technologies available to us.
Thomas, you mentioned that the reactor will fit in a 40-foot container. And the impression I got from your statement is that you can assemble or manufacture this reactor somewhere and literally ship it in a container on a ship anywhere in the world?
Yes, correct.
Thank you very much, Thomas Jam, for that excellent explanation. It would seem reasonable to assume that because the technology you are developing is so strategic to energy transition, that if they fully understood this story that you mentioned, every government on earth basically would be after you and knocking on your door, trying to basically bring your advanced reactor technology to their country. But from what you mentioned, your experience has been almost the opposite, with the challenges and the approvals and other things. So please tell us about those challenges you have faced trying to select a country in which you need to do the test, certify the thorium waste burner reactor, and all the other problems that you've been facing with this.
Yes, I'll be happy to explain a little bit
Thank you.
about that. So actually, I'm an eager student of technology history, not only nuclear technology, but many different technologies over decades and centuries. How did different technologies develop? And the story is the same over and over again with many different technologies. Some of the most important technologies that we humans have developed take many decades from their sort of inception until they get mass adoption. For example, one example is that 20 years after the car was invented, 20 years after the cars started to drive around on the roads, there was still more investments going towards the horse carriage industries than towards this new car industry. And it just shows that the investors, even in those 20 years, were not able to see that the car was the future. And the same repeats over and over again. You can say the same for the internet. The internet was developed in the 1960s. And I think most of you guys didn't start using the internet until sometimes in the 1990s. And for example, the airplane, it was developed back in, around 1900, but it was not until 30, 40 years later that it became a commercial offering. And it goes on and on like that with many different products. The mobile phone also took more than 4 decades to develop into a commercial product. And of course, this technology that we are offering, for one thing, it sounds too good to be true. So many people are a little bit skeptical up front when they hear about it for the first time. The next problem is that for most technologies that we humans develop, there's not a big hurdle of bureaucracy that you have to push through in order to bring your product to the market. But for nuclear reactors, it's one of the biggest hurdles of any technology I've ever worked with, even bigger than making new medicines or something like that. So it's a huge challenge for us as a company, but also for our investors to figure out how can we push through that wall of bureaucracy to get these reactors tested. And that's exactly the reason why we started with a very simple and small 1 megawatt test reactor to get that up and running, so we can show the world that it actually works before we go to commercial reactors. And like you said, we've been talking to a number of countries where we could potentially test this, and we have signed contracts in several countries where we can move on. I mean, it's a long process to get these approvals, so we are moving on through this process in several countries. But you're absolutely right that it's not the politicians who get it. I mean, that's not because it's nuclear energy. For any technology, politicians are usually some of the last ones to understand new technologies and what impact they will have on society. It's usually mostly sort of investors and business developers and tech people who are interested in new technologies and understanding how they will impact the markets and the development. And of course, again, also with this technology, those are the ones who are interested in this. But a lot of investors get a little bit scared when they hear that it's almost impossible to get a price and a timeline from any country about how long it's going to take to get these approvals. I mean, you can sort of get a cost and a timeline of what it takes to develop the technology, but investors get a little bit worried. Then, there's been some bad stories from the nuclear industry where things takes 5 or 10 years or sometimes even longer. And if this will take 10 years to get an approval, it could potentially kill a company like ourselves. I don't think it'll take that long. And like I said, we are already in process. For example, Switzerland, that's one of the countries where we're moving forward with the authorities and building buildings and getting things up to speed. So I'm confident that we will get the first test reactor online in 2026, but it's much easier to get a test reactor online. The next step is to get a commercial reactor. And we really have to push the authorities to be able to approve reactors faster than what has happened in the past, because especially in the West, like Eric mentioned, it takes way too long, like 10 years to approve something that is already well proven decades earlier. I mean, that's crazy, and we have to work with that. And that's also part of the reason why I'm here in this podcast. Last thing I want to mention is you mentioned that our product is called a nuclear waste burner, and that's back to this question that you guys were talking about earlier. Couldn't we call it something else? Many of these traditional reactors are called, a 3 or 4-letter acronym, and nobody really, except people in the nuclear industry, can remember what this stands for. There was the light water reactor, there's the pressurized water reactor, and all these other that uses acronyms, high temperature gas cooled reactors and so on. But we didn't want to do that in Copenhagen Atomics, and we thought about, okay, let's call it Copenhagen Atomics waste burner, because it's actually able to take spent nuclear fuel from traditional nuclear reactors and use that fuel one more time. And when we use it in our reactor, we get 10 times more energy out of that fuel, which has already been discarded, and than what came out of the fuel in the first place. So that is amazing that we can take a waste product, and then what we leave behind, the waste we leave behind, is much less of a problem. It only needs to be stored 300 years above ground versus the typical 100,000 years in deep geological storage, which is very expensive. So this is another way that we try to make nuclear energy much less expensive. I hope that gave an idea of what we're trying in towards getting this online. And Eric was right. I mean, there will be 1 or 2 countries who get this before all the other countries. And once these countries, invest into companies like our own, they will be able to really make a lot of progress and go ahead of the other company or the other countries. And it's also correct that China is one of those countries that have already seen the light and are moving in that direction. But China is mostly going to supply energy for their own internal domestic use and maybe a few other countries. But we also need companies in the West that can do the same for the rest of the world, basically.
Just a quick question here. How was China able to cut this bureaucracy that the others are experiencing?
Yeah, so I've only been to China a couple of times at nuclear conferences, Of course, I've been traveling there as a tourist or as a business person, but so I have limited experience with the nuclear industry in China. But one of the things I did see is that, I mean, they have a political system that really focuses on how can we solve problems, and in a completely different way than what we have in the West. And this is one of the reasons why they are sort of more what is it called? They try to find solutions instead of trying to slow things down on purpose, and they try to be pragmatic about how can we test this new technology in a way where it doesn't become dangerous and where it doesn't cost billions of dollars. And I think they have found a way. And actually, what they've done is that they've copied a lot of the design back from the Oak Ridge reactor in Tennessee back in the 1960s. So, for example, the pump, they just made almost a complete copy of that pump. And I don't think in the Western approval authorities, they would not approve that pump design back from the 60s. That's also why we have made a different pump design, because we didn't believe that one could get approved. But in China, they said, hey, they already built one that worked for 5 years. Let's copy that, make it work, and then we can always make a better work version afterwards. And that's because in China, it's possible to get that sort of technology approved sort of in a first instance. And then once it's working, then they can improve on it. I think the Chinese are doing that in a clever way, and we should learn from that in the West.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Eric, I would like to ask you a couple of questions before I return to Justin and ask him about investment issues. So you emphasized earlier that you had more to say on reducing cost, and Thomas mentioned that too. So what's on your mind now, given what Thomas said?
Well, thank you so much, Anis, for bringing up this issue of cost, because I think this is going to be the most important thing that I have to say in this entire spaces, especially for our listeners in the Arab world. But before I go to that, I just want to briefly go back to what Thomas was saying about the challenges that he faces, because absolutely, to be sure, governments can create bureaucracy that slows things down for decades. But let's put this in context. That first experiment that just showed that it was possible to generate electricity from nuclear energy was in 1951. All they managed to accomplish was to illuminate 4 light bulbs, literally hanging from a string across the middle of the laboratory. There's a picture of that you can find on the internet. 4 short years later, the Nautilus nuclear submarine entered service, full of sailors went to sea under nuclear power. That required more engineering than we're going to need for this entire energy transition. So when a government decides they want to make something happen and it becomes their national priority, they have no trouble making things happen quickly. It's when it's not their national priority that things go so incredibly slowly. So my version of that answer on China would be somehow this message about the importance of advanced nuclear reactor designs managed to get up to a high enough level in the government that somebody decided we're going to make this our national priority. And all of a sudden, they're going gangbusters, just as the US did, back in the Cold War when they were developing all this nuclear technology. When the government wants to make something happen, they can make it happen very quickly. So let's come back to cost, because that's so important. We can extol all of the advantages of nuclear energy, talk about it all day long. But what matters at the end of the day is the bottom line. And simply put, conventional nuclear costs too much and it takes too long to build. Conventional nuclear power plants that are based on the Westinghouse AP1000, which is the American, the Western sort of flagship product these days, that pressurized light water reactor costs anywhere from $7,000 to $15,000 per kilowatt of electric generation capacity. And that's just to build the power plant. South Korea is much better at doing that economically. They can build a similar power plant for about $5,000 per kilowatt, but that's still 5 times what it would cost to build a gas-fired power plant. And the gas-fired power plant could have been built in half the time. So because of that build cost premium, The electricity that nuclear power plants produce is always going to cost considerably more than the electricity that's made from coal or natural gas. And to be sure, now nuclear power has got to be much better, it's much safer, it's much cleaner. There's so many things that are better about it. But let's face it, folks, anything that costs 5 times as much as its competition costs is going to face a lot of challenges achieving market penetration. So it doesn't really matter how much better or safer or cleaner it is if it costs 5 times as much. I contend that right here, right now in 2024, we've just reached an unprecedented moment of opportunity in world history. And that opportunity is to dramatically reduce the cost of nuclear energy so that safe, clean, limitless nuclear energy actually costs less than energy that's produced from fossil fuels. This is what I've begun calling the nuclear Henry Ford moment. Everybody in business has studied Henry Ford's invention of the assembly line. Before Ford, automobiles were like private jets are today. Everybody wants one, but only a handful of the wealthiest people in society can afford one. What Henry Ford realized was that if he could capture the economies of scale inherent to assembly line mass production, he could bring the cost down to the point that ordinary people would be able to afford an automobile. The rest is history, and it profoundly changed the world. That analogy fits perfectly. We've been building nuclear reactors for more than 75 years now. And to this day, less than 500 power reactors are operating worldwide, and they produce about 371 gigawatts of electricity. Now, anything that's being produced at the rate of just a few units per year obviously can't benefit from assembly line mass production because there isn't enough volume to keep an assembly line running. But stop and consider how strong the global political commitment has become to energy transition and solving climate change. Even after 25 years of heavy government subsidies, wind and solar combined still only supply about 3% of global energy demand. This planet urgently needs to build about 9,000 gigawatts of clean electric generation capacity in order to fully replace all the energy that we derive from fossil fuels today. Now, to put that in perspective, it would take about 225,000 of Thomas Cham's waste burner reactor modules just to fully replace all the energy that we derive from fossil fuels today. And that's not, accommodating future growth needs and, additional demand and so forth. So it's not just a matter of tripling nuclear energy. To make nuclear our primary solution for energy transition and climate change, we would need to increase nuclear energy, not by 3 times, but by 24.3 times. My point is that while global demand for nuclear power plants has been less than 500 units total in the last 75 years, energy transition will create sufficient demand to build at least 200,000 small modular reactors in the next 25 years, if we can somehow figure out a way to make them cost competitive with fossil fuels and renewables. And that's a completely, totally different business model. If you're talking about building 200,000 of something as opposed to just a few of something, there's a completely different set of cost and business dynamics there. So all of a sudden, you can embrace the benefits of fully robotic assembly and test lines, which deliver immaculate quality control. Once you've done that, the economies of scale inherent to that assembly line mass production will bring the unit cost down dramatically. And once the unit cost comes down, well, that's exactly what creates the demand for 200,000 units in the first place. So it's exactly the same chicken and egg problem that Henry Ford faced. You've got to make this big investment in the assembly line in order to bring the cost down enough to create the demand to justify that assembly line. Now, assuming that each unit, each reactor that's produced is going to be a small modular reactor that only produces 100 megawatts of thermal energy. That's what Thomas Cham's waste burner reactor is designed to do. Well, the only reason that conventional nuclear could never achieve that kind of market share is because it costs too much. But if you're producing reactors on high volume assembly lines, we can bring their costs down to the point where nuclear power plants cost less than fossil fuel fired power plants. And that's when demand will explode. and we'll be able to build nuclear baseload capacity for the entire planet, fully solving energy transition and climate change by doing that. Now, you can't do this with conventional nuclear energy. Conventional large-scale nuclear reactors are already designed in modular components. They're already built off-site whenever it's possible to do that. But there's still a lot of bespoke on-site construction that simply cannot occur in a remote factory because the components that have to be manufactured would be too large to transport. So it has to be built on site. And that means that conventional nuclear will always have a private jet price tag as opposed to a Model T Ford price tag. Contrast that with Thomas Jam's reactor, which was designed around the ISO standard 40-foot shipping container precisely because that would enable assembly line mass production and then practical economic delivery anywhere on Earth. There's another reason, though, that we can't solve energy transition with conventional nuclear energy that's based on low enriched uranium fuel. And that reason is simply that we wouldn't be able to ramp up uranium mining and enrichment fast enough. And even if we did, doing that in such massive scale would further increase the weapons proliferation risk. Now, Justin understands the nuclear fuel market better than anybody. His trading returns clearly evidence that. So while I have more to say about this issue of cost in energy transition, I want to pause for a second and ask Justin a question. Justin, as you know, we have less than 500 power reactors in service worldwide today, and you're already predicting fuel shortages in the next few years based solely on the needs of that existing fleet alone. Large-scale conventional reactors like the Westinghouse AP1000 have much higher power ratings than the small modular reactors like Thomas Jam's company is building. So we wouldn't need 225,000 of them to solve energy transition. We'd only need about 10,000 more AP1000s in order to completely replace all the energy that we derive from fossil fuels today. So Justin, I want you to imagine a world where somebody announces that their intention is to build 10,000 more AP1000s. For now, let's just ignore the impossibilities of actually, tooling up that many construction teams all simultaneously. Pretend that we could actually build 10,000 more AP1000 nuclear reactors, all burning low enriched uranium fuel between now and 2050. By my reckoning, that would increase the demand for low enriched uranium fuel products by 24.3 times the current demand. Justin, do you think there's any remotely plausible way, and include every possibility, seawater recovery, anything you can think of, is there any way that we could scale up conversion and enrichment of natural uranium, or even find and mine enough natural uranium in order to produce enough low enriched uranium to fuel 10,000 more AP1000 reactors?
I think it would be a pretty big challenge, Eric. I honestly do. It's already a challenge currently, like I mentioned, for the mining sector to catch up with the pricing environment. But clearly, supply will be able to respond. It just takes time. The mining sector is very slow to respond, especially with this particular commodity. It's not like oil and gas that can respond relatively quickly to spiking prices. So. But if we see a sustained higher price, let's say north of $200 a pound, and it stays there for multiple years, we're going to see innovations come online to be able to produce into that environment. Seawater extraction, I think, is kind of in its infancy. It's still relatively energy intensive to actually do. And the Chinese are working on it. There's multiple other companies, private, that are working on it in other countries as well. And I think we will see seawater extraction at some point, and there's a heck of a lot of uranium in the oceans. The other big one is uranium held in phosphates, and most of the world's phosphates are in Morocco, but there's a lot of phosphate tails. It is waste material essentially in the United States and in China that can be processed to extract uranium from. And the future of uranium from phosphates is probably something we're going to see, especially if we see heightened prices for both commodities. I think that'll happen. But to be able to fuel 10,000 AP1000s, I think is a pretty big ask on the uranium front and on the fuel cycle front. Is it technically possible? Probably. Will we be able to do it? I don't think so. But I also think this is looking at sort of an idealistic hypothetical. I'm not necessarily in the camp that I think that we should trudge on in the way that society is doing now in the same trajectory for the next 100 years, electrify everything, ignore efficiencies, and figure out how to power it. I don't think that's necessarily an intelligent way to operate as a species, really, but that seems to be what we're doing. We're trying to electrify transportation and electrify heat, and we had the advent of AI-powered search, which consumes 10 to 20 times a normal search. Not to even mention just the increasing computing power of the cloud data centers, etc. So we're really increasing the amount of electricity we're consuming, and the projections of that are not looking at efficiencies pretty much whatsoever, other than we're looking at quote unquote, trying to cut down on carbon emissions. And those pictures, I think, are going to have kind of a reckoning at some point in the next few decades. We're not going to be able to have it all. So I honestly would prefer to see a future where we actually look at energy efficiencies, not necessarily solely through a carbon emissions lens, whereas zero carbon equals good. I think that there's other things that we need to consider. So most likely we'll have a future with all of the above. I think we could double or triple our light water, boiling water reactor fleet, heavy water as well. I don't know why that gets looked over. Heavy water reactors, by the way, as a side note, my understanding is the existing heavy water reactor fleet, which is about 10% of the world's nuclear reactors, technically can run on thorium fuel with a little bit of plutonium. Zero of them are doing it. So that's a question why. Why aren't we doing that? But I think we could double or triple our existing light water, boiling water, heavy water reactor fleet, and forge ahead with Thomas Jam's style advanced nuclear reactors, thorium powered molten salt reactors, high temperature gas reactors, all of the above. And the race to come up with the best mousetrap in terms of these advanced and small modular reactors is extremely exciting. I think that holds a bright future. But all of the above, energy efficiency, various forms of nuclear with various types of fuels. We're obviously probably going to see an increasing amount of solar and wind as part of a grid. I know we all know on this call that we have diminishing returns on renewables. You can only take up a certain percentage of the grid before it leads to instability that's very difficult to handle without massive grid scale storage, which we're just not there yet in terms of battery power. And all of the above. Perhaps someday we'll see deep geothermal come online in a much bigger way, which I think holds great potential for meeting some future energy demand. But long answer short, can we expand the nuclear fuel cycle and uranium mining to fuel 10,000, 1 gigawatt size light water reactors? I think that's a pretty big ask. So, short answer is probably no. I think that's very difficult.
Just as you were speaking, Justin, it occurred to me we could, if there was listener interest, we could probably do an entire spaces just on the fuel sourcing challenges of nuclear renaissance, comparing conventional versus advanced reactor technology in terms of their fuel demands. So that's a fascinating story in its own right. If there's interest, we could do another session on that someday. Going back to where we were, though, when you use a thorium fuel cycle, each reactor only needs to be fueled with each reactor only needs to be fueled with uranium fuel just once. And it's a relatively small load of uranium fuel at that. A really fancy thorium reactor, like the one that Thomas Jam is building, doesn't even need that initial load of low enriched uranium. It can be started with a shot of reprocessed spent fuel waste that's left over from today's fleet of light water reactors. So you can actually use up the nuclear waste that we have in storage and use it as fuel in Thomas Jam's reactor in order to get the thing started to the point where it begins converting thorium into uranium-233, and then that sustains it from there. From there, it basically refuels itself by making more fissile uranium-233 out of thorium. Thorium is 4 times more plentiful in Earth's crust than uranium is, and it also doesn't require any conversion or enrichment. And that eliminates all of the weapons proliferation risks associated with countries having their own centrifuges for enriching uranium. So you can see now that thorium is really, I think, the only realistic fuel cycle to choose if you truly intend to scale nuclear up to fully solve energy transition. And make no mistake, China understands every bit of this. They understand it better than I do, and they're already acting on that understanding. Now, you said a minute ago, Justin, that China is already, doing a bunch of work on seawater extraction. Well, seawater extraction is not economic until well over $200 per pound, double the current price. China doesn't do anything for double the current price unless they can see what's coming and they know the price is going up and they know they're going to need that seawater extraction technology because there's not going to be enough uranium. The West, on the other hand, is falling badly behind. The nuclear Henry Ford moment of opportunity is upon us right now, but the investment proposition is even more daunting than the one that Henry Ford faced, which could have bankrupted him if he had misjudged how much demand creation would result from the price reductions that his assembly lines would end up ultimately delivering. We're not talking now about mass producing automobiles. We're talking about mass producing fourth generation, state of the art nuclear reactors. That's a huge jump in complexity and in cost. Thomas Jam figured all this stuff out years ago, and that's why his waste burner reactor is designed to fit in a shipping container. He'll make great progress in reducing the cost of nuclear energy. I have complete faith in Thomas Jam and in Copenhagen Atomics to achieve that goal. But with all due respect, Thomas Jam, you don't have anywhere close to the amount of capital that's needed to truly seize the opportunity that's being created right now by what I'm calling the Henry Ford moment of opportunity. Copenhagen Atomic's non-robotic assembly line is only going to make a few hundred reactors per year, and it'll make them much more economically than we build reactors today. It's going to be a huge step forward, but we're still talking about just a few hundred units a year, maybe 10 or 15 gigawatts of new electric generation capacity per year based on these very ambitious plans that Thomas Jam has. Now, I should confess that for the first time that Thomas Jam told me that was his plan, I thought he was crazy because it was too ambitious. I figured that if we've only got 500 power reactors in production after 75 years, it's crazy to be talking about assembly lines. Then I sat down and I actually did the arithmetic. And my conclusion was that if anything, Thomas Jam's plans to build one reactor per day are woefully insufficient to make a meaningful difference in energy transition. Because to replace all the energy that we currently derive from fossil fuels, we would need to produce at least one reactor the size of Thomas Jam's waste burner reactor. We'd have to produce one of those per hour, not per day. And we'd have to produce one of those reactors per hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for 15 years straight. That's a completely, totally different ballgame. And it invites a completely different approach to manufacturing, to distribution, and to construction of nuclear power plants than was ever possible before. That's the nuclear Henry Ford moment. So let's change the scenario now and imagine an entrepreneur who's just as smart as Thomas Jam, but who's much better capitalized. He can afford to take this proposition to a completely different level by building a fully robotic factory that builds thorium-fueled molten salt reactors at the rate of 1 unit per hour, as opposed to 1 per day that Thomas Jam's company is planning. Now, that's a whole different level of economy of scale, and I'm convinced that it could make nuclear energy even cheaper than energy from fossil fuels. But it's not just the reactors that we need to modularize and mass produce. A really smart modern-day Henry Ford would recognize that what's needed are not just modular nuclear reactors like Thomas Jam is building, but rather entire modular nuclear power plants built in mass production factories and then delivered by container ship. This would allow the gigawatt power plants that we need for energy transition, the ones that would take 7 or more years to build with conventional nuclear, and it would make it possible to build them in less than 1 year and at a lower cost than building a gas-fired power plant. To achieve this, other components of nuclear power plants beyond just the nuclear reactors would have to be upgraded to modern technology. For example, the steam turbines that are used to convert heat energy into electricity in conventional nuclear power plants are incredibly expensive and inefficient, not to mention being physically too large to modularize and deliver economically without requiring expensive bespoke on-site assembly. The solution to that problem is a new technology called supercritical carbon dioxide turbines. And we need to develop and mature that technology aggressively because it's going to play an incredibly important role in making it possible to build nuclear power plants for less money and in less time than it takes to build a coal or gas-fired power plant. So I'm passionate about what's possible for humanity thanks to this nuclear Henry Ford moment of opportunity that I've done quite a bit of work just trying to figure out exactly what it would take to build those modular nuclear power plants for lower cost than, say, a coal or gas-fired power plant. Well, guess what? I think it is possible, but the capital investment required in order to build that factory, to build the modular power plant components, is going to be considerably bigger than what Ford had to spend on his Model T plant, actually a lot bigger. So who in the world could possibly afford to seize this nuclear Henry Ford moment of opportunity? It seems to me that the Arab states, with a strong vested interest in staying in the energy business long beyond the age of oil, are the obvious candidates. And the reason I say that is they're the ones who have the sovereign wealth that's needed in order to build that very expensive, fully robotic modular nuclear power plant factory that I've described. It's a much bigger undertaking than Henry Ford's Model T factory was. And they also have a clearly established motive to protect their interest as global leaders in supplying energy to the rest of the world. They want to stay in the energy business. But let's face it, the lesson of the Henry Ford story was it was the man who had both the vision and the courage to act on that vision that made the whole thing happen. When Ford built his assembly line, there wasn't anywhere close to sufficient demand to warrant having that assembly line, just as there isn't demand today for enough nuclear power plants to justify building them in robotic factories and delivering them on container ship-sized modules. Ford had the courage to trust his own analysis. He had the courage to know that the lower prices that he would be able to offer would result in creating demand that didn't exist before he built his assembly lines. So seizing this present nuclear Henry Ford moment is going to require even greater vision and commitment because the stakes are even higher than they were for Henry Ford. So I've thought long and hard about who on earth has both the capital and, quite frankly, the intestinal fortitude to pull off what I've been describing. And I only come up with three names: Mohammed bin Zayed, Mohammed bin Salman, and Elon Musk. Now, Elon doesn't have his own sovereign nation yet, so he'd be maybe a slight disadvantage. But he's a clever guy, and he could figure out how to work around the malfeasance of Western regulators if he had to. Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman, on the other hand, are much more serious candidates to my thinking because, first of all, they've got the money to do this, but they also are leaders of sovereign nations who don't have to be beholden to the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They can establish their own nuclear regulators or grow their existing nuclear regulator in the case of the UAE in order to fast track the development of these advanced technologies, something that you can't do unless you actually are controlling a sovereign nation. So I think it takes a head of state or somebody as enterprising as Elon Musk to pull this off. So for our Arab listeners in particular, I truly believe that you guys are better equipped than anyone else on earth to lead the charge on energy transition globally for the entire planet. And the reason I say that is just because you're in the position to be able to do these very ambitious things. You've got to have a lot of money to do this, and you've got to have a vested interest in staying in the business of supplying energy to the rest of the world long beyond the age of oil. Doing so would allow you to increase rather than decrease your share of the global energy market as we slowly transition from the age of oil to the age of nuclear. So the way to solve both energy transition and climate change is to build enough clean energy to eliminate fossil fuel dependence. The only way, so far as I can see, to build that much nuclear energy capacity, and we're talking about a whole lot more than just tripling nuclear here, folks. We're talking about a 24x, not a 3x on nuclear in order to fully solve this problem. The only way to do that, I think, is to make nuclear somehow cost less than energy from coal and gas. And the only way I can see to make nuclear cost less than coal and gas is to mass produce entire nuclear power plants as modular units that are built on fully robotic assembly and test lines. And that means the only way it can ever happen at all is if somebody who has both the capital, the vision, and most importantly, the courage needed to act on that vision to seize this nuclear Henry Ford moment that I've just described. Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed are the obvious candidates. But unfortunately, I don't have their cell numbers and they're not easy people to get meetings with. I'm absolutely convinced, though, that those are the people who could lead the entire world through energy transition by seizing control of the advanced nuclear industry, taking companies like Copenhagen Atomics and giving them a place to come and test and certify their reactors that doesn't take 10 years, and building modular nuclear power plants in fully robotic factories. The advantages over conventional nuclear energy are so compelling by themselves, but getting the cost down is the absolute requirement. No matter how compelling it is, if it costs 5 times more than other forms of energy, it's never going to fly. We've got to get the cost down. I've already done quite a bit of work on this. I've been spending the last several months just focusing on this question of how do you get the cost down? And it's clear to me that whoever does this, whoever pulls this off, is going to dominate the energy industry for the next 100 years. And China, by the way, is already very hard at work on this. But it's way beyond my reach as an entrepreneur to just say, okay, I know what needs to be done, but you've got to be a head of state with the resources of a sovereign wealth fund to pull off what I'm talking about. And frankly, it's beyond the capabilities of any energy company anywhere on earth. It can't happen until a head of state with Henry Ford's vision and a sovereign wealth fund backing them sees this, recognizes it, and decides to make it their priority. When somebody at that head of state level decides, okay, we're not going to do this in the 10 years of bureaucracy model, we're going to do it in the model that got the United States from 4 light bulbs on a string to a working nuclear submarine 4 years later. We're going to put this as top priority. We're going to make this happen. Somebody at a senior enough level makes that decision, seizes the Henry Ford moment, and I think we can deliver nuclear power plants that cost less than coal and gas-fired power plants. Now, China is the heir apparent. They're already well positioned to be the nation to do this, and they're already building advanced reactors faster than anybody else. But for now, their focus appears to be entirely on building out China's own energy infrastructure. They're not thinking about selling this to anybody else. They're just trying to make China the most competitive manufacturing, super conglomerate in the history of the world. And I think they're going to succeed at that. So, and they also are going to take their container ship fleet nuclear. So far, they're not selling this technology to other countries. They don't appear to be set up to do that. I haven't heard any announcements along those lines. I predict that will change with time. And mark my words, if any other nation besides China wants to be a key player in the age of nuclear and wants to, secure their position as a supplier of energy in the age of nuclear, time is very much of the essence for them to get to work right now, catching up with China, because China has a big lead already. There are several countries that could pull this off. India comes to mind as a possibility because they already have a well-developed nuclear program. But so does the UAE. And in terms of bringing together the confluence of sufficient capital to make something like this happen, a strong motive to remain in the business of supplying energy to the rest of the world long after the age of oil, and a proven track record taking on and succeeding at really big government-led initiatives like the Burj Khalifa, or in the case of Saudi Arabia, the Shaiba oil field. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are my top picks. So, of course, I'd love to see my own country, the United States, do this. But frankly, we've been screwing up nuclear energy policy for my entire lifetime. And I don't see that changing unless we have just a completely different national leadership than we have today. So in closing, the reason cost is just so important is that if we can make nuclear energy cost less than fossil fuel energy, it's going to start this domino effect process, which will allow the nation that does this to dominate the energy industry for decades, if not centuries to come. As far as I can tell, the UAE, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the other big Arab states are really the only actors who have both the capital needed, the control of a sovereign nation, which allows you to fast track the certification and development of new technologies without being beholden to the U.S. regulators and other regulators. They're the ones that could pull this off. And as sovereign nations, if they made it their national strategic priority, I think that we could get to this complete solution to energy transition and climate change that fully solves those problems, and it would cement the position of whoever does this as a supplier of energy to the rest of the world with a much higher market share even than Saudi Arabia had at the height of its role during the age of oil. And again, China's already doing this. So the time to get to work on this is right now. Back to you, Anas.
Thank you very much, Eric. Speaking of the Arab world, looking at the economies of the Arab world, the growth, the population growth in the next 50 years, 4 countries in the Arab world need nuclear power plants as soon as possible. Otherwise, they will have problems. That's Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Algeria, and Morocco. All of them are working on something right now. We know in the Arab world that only the UAE has nuclear power plants. Saudi Arabia is working on it. They are still doing the legal work, etc. Egypt is building one. The Russians are building it, but it seems they've been having problems because of the sanctions and the invasion of Ukraine. Algeria is looking at it. Morocco is looking at it, but they really need it because the population growth, the economic growth, etc., means either future power shortages in cases of Egypt. They are already experiencing 2 to 4 hours of power shortage right now. This will happen in Algeria. This will happen in Morocco as we go with the expected growth. For Saudi Arabia, with the expected growth, which is going to be a massive growth, given it is the largest economy in the area, you have 2030 vision, etc. It will be at the expense of their gas. It will be at the expense of their oil. So the only way they can export oil and probably end up exporting gas in the future is to have nuclear and renewables. So that's the case for the Arab world. I do have 2 questions for Justin and Thomas. First of all, Thomas, for the technology you guys are working on, I just want to make sure that this is a civilian technology and no one can use it for any military use, right?
It is absolutely for civilian use, and that's a long story. But Eric did a very clear presentation before that it was looked at during the Manhattan Project, and it wasn't. They didn't say that it's impossible to make bombs from thorium and uranium-233, but it was clearly not worth it for them to go down that route. There has been almost 10 countries trying to build nuclear weapons since then, and they have also chosen the uranium-235 and in some cases plutonium-239 for bombs. Nobody has ever chosen the thorium and uranium-233 routes. So it still stands that it's a very much more difficult route, but it's not entirely impossible. But like I said, we only want to focus on civilian nuclear power, and the world really needs that. And I think we've shown over the last 70 years that nuclear power can be safe. And I mean, some of the worst countries in the world or dangerous countries in the world have nuclear bombs already. So why should we keep that technology away from other countries that will use it for good, basically?
Thank
Honest,
you very much.
could I add a quick point on that?
Go ahead.
I just wanted to point out, in addition to what Thomas Chem said, if you were to try to do a major initiative, let's say in Saudi Arabia, to build a whole bunch of, start going into the business of building and selling uranium fueled power plants, you're going to be accused of trying to hide a weapons program. It's just the mindset of the paranoid world that we live in. On the other hand, if you go into the business of building thorium-fueled molten salt reactors, there is no need for enriching anything. You don't need to have the things that would put you at risk of that. So you're not going to be accused of trying to conceal or hide a nuclear weapons program, because you wouldn't be using uranium-233 and thorium if that was your goal. So I think it has a double benefit there.
Thank you. The second question is for Justin and Thomas. The original question is from our friend Kumar. He's asking about the nuclear engineers. If you guys go with your vision and what Justin talked about the future of nuclear energy, do we have enough engineers? And I would like to add to that is, are our universities and are the universities in the US and Europe and Saudi Arabia and others, I mean, are they able to produce that many experts or engineers or workers, whatever you need for those plants? Justin?
It's hard for me to say on the engineering front. Maybe Thomas Jam can answer that part of the question better than I can. But I will say that pretty much across every industry that's requiring technical skilled labor and tradespeople, they're in relatively short supply. That's just how things are going currently in various different sectors. That's not unique to let's say, the uranium mining sector or the fuel cycle. That's something that's going to have to be addressed for certain in order to expand. I mean, let alone sustain the industry as it is right now. There's, the average age of somebody in the mining sector in the United States is in their mid to late 50s, and there's just not a whole lot of interest from younger people to go into these trades. And that's going to be a common problem, seemingly globally, and it's going to have to be addressed in order to achieve the types of goals that we're talking about in the spaces here today.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yes, so our company, of course, to employ nuclear engineers, but actually it's less than 10% of our employees. We also need chemical engineers, mechanical engineers, software engineers, all kinds of other technical skilled people like electrician and welders and stuff. So it is not easy to get highly qualified personnel, but that has always been a problem for tech industries. I can say that because our company has started here in Copenhagen, there's 2 universities here that have not now started a nuclear course, and there are so many young people who want to attend that. So they're sitting in the windows and standing up in the back of the lecture hall. So there's a lot of interest from young people to go into this industry because they see a big opportunity. I think also what we saw with the UAE, that when they wanted to build the power plants, they were able to attract people from Europe and other places to move to UAE to help build up that industry there. I think the same could happen again. We can easily move people from countries where there are people with a nuclear interest and a nuclear background. And again, most of the people we need are actually the regular engineers, the mechanical engineers, the electrical engineers, and so on. So I don't see it as one of the big problems. Uranium supply, like we talked about, is one of the issues, and definitely also this whole approval process and the scare that the investors currently are a little bit reluctant to invest because they cannot get any security around, what is required, when can this happen. So one more country, like Eric said, that works in the same way as what China is currently doing, making this a high priority, will definitely make things move much faster.
Another question for Justin and Thomas. What are your comments on the media's coverage of the industry, and what do you want from the media? Let's start with Justin.
Well, I think that the media coverage tends to shift with the public sentiment. And I think that we're starting to see that. Most of the articles that we might see printed currently that are, let's say, negative on nuclear energy, if you do a little bit of digging, there's usually some sort of special interest behind it. And historically speaking, that's been the case as well. For example, there's enormous support in the anti-nuclear movement over the past decades that has been largely funded by the oil and gas lobby. And any time a nuclear power plant shuts down prematurely, it's usually the oil and gas, and specifically natural gas, and sometimes even coal, that picks up the pieces. Like if we look in Germany, their plants that were shut down prematurely, they've had to make up for that loss in energy by expanding both coal and natural gas, because their $500 billion invested into solar and wind isn't cutting it. So, the media coverage is improving, and I think that that's gone along with the shifting in public sentiment where you're looking at in most countries, especially countries that have operating nuclear power plants. You have the public majority in support of nuclear, in support of sustaining those plants, life extending, and potentially even building new nuclear. And we're starting to see more and more positive articles being written about nuclear, and again, not only just public sentiment, but seeing the acceptance of nuclear, especially by, let's call it, the environmental left, has been a big support of that positive, the positive highlighting of nuclear within the media. What do I want from the media? I mean, I guess what I want from the media in terms of their coverage of nuclear is what I want from the media just in general, is to speak truthfully about about pretty much anything. That would be nice. To do that from nuclear would be unexpected but appreciated. Just to actually share the historical safety data, because that's what people really tend to have a lot of fear around with nuclear, because it's associated with nuclear weaponry, or because of a couple of accidents that have happened in the history of civilian nuclear. One of them being really bad was at Chernobyl. But how about an explanation that's honest about why that happened and why that won't happen again? Those types of things would be good. But I admit that I'm very impressed and encouraged by the overall shift in sentiment around nuclear and the embracing of nuclear by the environmental left, and that is starting to be reflected in the media. So I'm happy to see that.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, it's a little bit the same. I personally, I don't trust traditional media like TV and newspapers. They, on so many subjects, they are misinforming, and they are not honest about their information, like Justin says. That's why many people, including myself, have started using other news channels like this one, and of course, Twitter. At least in some areas, seems to be a more balanced and more honest information media. And I think the world is changing away from those media that are misinforming us. And also on nuclear, there's been a lot of misinformation over the last decades. It is improving a little bit, but I think basically people are moving over to channels where the information is more correct and more balanced.
Thank you. Justin, I want to come back to you now, because you said at the beginning, when we started the session 2 hours ago, that as an investor who focuses primarily on the immediate opportunity to make money from trading uranium stocks and ETFs, you looked forward to hearing what Eric and Thomas Jam had to say. So after everything you heard from them, what are your thoughts right now? What is your reaction?
Well, I think it's simply a reiterating of where we're already at in terms of our forward-looking, let's say, expectations in the investment landscape for the sector. Very, very encouraged about the various different advanced reactor SMR designs that are out there. And I think as the years go by, we're going to see many of these companies have initial public offerings and become publicly traded companies that will be investable for the broader investing public. So I suppose after hearing all of this commentary, I just feel even more, let's say, confident and optimistic and excited about the investing opportunities going forward. And we're always on the lookout for the next positive investing opportunity within this space, because I think that the investors are actually starting to look out for these opportunities as they come. We want to know how we can invest and not only just support the growth of this industry, but obviously have some returns on our investment going forward and following these big trends, which is this nuclear renaissance. So it's again, just like mining and reaction of supply to a rising price environment, it does take time for investable vehicles to make themselves publicly available over time, even within this surge in sentiment, this surge in enthusiasm around the expansion of nuclear globally. So very optimistic, and it's going to take time, but we're going to see a lot of opportunities, I think, in the coming 5 to 10 years in this space for sure.
Thank you. I would like to take a couple of questions from the listeners today. We are not going to take any comments today simply because we are running out of time. So we'll take only questions, and please make it one question that is very specific and very clear. Dr. Wajdi?
Thank you, Dr. Anas. Just a quick question. After thanking all the speakers for the significant information that we have here in the floor, my question is direct question to anyone on the floor. How might increased reliance on the nuclear energy impact the geopolitical landscape in the Arab world? Thank you.
Who wants to pick up this?
I'll
Eric?
give it a shot, Honest. I think that it is going to be very important to the geopolitical landscape, and I think it's going to be very interesting to navigate because on one hand, as I've described, I think that the opportunity couldn't possibly be better than for the Arab world to recognize that Henry Ford moment and seize it. And you guys have the capital and the wherewithal and the motive to do it. At the same time, it's inevitable that there's going to be a lot of paranoia and fear about weapons proliferation. So I think one of the most important things for the Arab world is as you look at increasing investment and exposure to nuclear technology, that you focus on the technologies which inherently either can't be used or not suitable or not optimal for anything having to do with weapons. Because if there's any plausible connection with weapons, somebody is going to accuse you of having that motive, whether it is or is not. And one of the things that Alvin Weinberg writes in his book, which, by the way, I can't recommend highly enough, it's called The First Nuclear Era. He explains that, you can't say that it's impossible to build a bomb out of U-233, just like Thomas said earlier. But what you can say is that it would be so much easier to just build your own centrifuges and enrich your own uranium to build a uranium-based bomb, that to try to build a bomb out of U-233 and thorium is just crazy. It doesn't make any sense. And so I think that whether it's thorium or some other technology, I think the Arab world in particular has to look at focusing its investments and its participation in nuclear in areas where nobody's going to be able to make false accusations about ulterior motives that probably don't really exist.
Thank you. Any comment, Justin or Thomas, on the political side?
No, I don't think I have anything to add on that front.
Also not me.
Thank you. Macro minutes?
Okay. I have a question for Eric. First of all, I just wanted to say thanks for having me up. And I listen to your podcast weekly, really enjoy the guests you have on. Question is regarding the, I guess, framing of nuclear proliferation, the build out of new nuclear globally. It seems that the framing right now has been focused on both a way to generate clean energy, but also as a way to, quote, fight climate change. And the concern that I have with that framing is that it feels to me that you're a bit seeding the frame that climate change is an existential threat to humanity, which I don't think the IPCC or any serious scientist really believes. It generally is, at worst, we're contributing a little bit to warming. And most of the time, the framing of this is it's Malthusian. And so you can't really win with these people. And the concern, I guess, would be do you feel that framing this as a way to fight climate change will eventually lead to people saying nuclear is still human impact and we don't like human impact, therefore we should also start to decommission nuclear? And the reason I bring this up is because that's exactly what happened in Germany, right? And I feel that that's because of the framing of nuclear is just human impact. It's bad for the environment in general. So just wanted to know
Eric?
what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think a lot about what the heck went wrong in Germany, because you talk about Germany is a country which historically is very well known as a leader in engineering, people who are very good at thinking objectively and logically. And to decommission perfectly good nuclear power plants and then scramble to build much, much more dangerous and highly polluting coal-fired plants to replace them is absolute insanity. So, what the heck happened there? I struggle with this because, on one hand, if you want to promote a nuclear future, which I very much believe in as saving us from the coming oil and gas energy crisis, which I'm absolutely convinced will be upon us by 2030, I think nuclear is the only plausible way to solve that problem and to save humanity from the coming energy crisis. And I think it also has the potential to really carry humanity to a new level of prosperity. We had a constantly increasing level of standard of living until 1974. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that's the year that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was created in the United States. We need to get back to constantly increasing amount of per capita energy consumption, which is the best proxy that we have. So when I talk about this publicly, I struggle with, well, on one hand, you've got so much momentum behind climate change that describing it as a solution to climate change means that if you can persuade that climate audience, and it does seem like they're being persuaded now, you've got that huge political momentum behind you, or if you can get it behind you, it's a tremendous tailwind. At the same time, I think that some of the climate claims have been exaggerated and taken out of context, as you're suggesting. And I don't really want to, associate myself with being a climate alarmist. And I don't want my claims about nuclear solving climate change to be perceived that way. What I've tried to do is I focus everything that I try to say publicly on energy transition rather than climate change. And the way I think about this is the climate change community wants energy transition. So they're going to like an energy transition message. But when I talk about energy transition, I don't talk about it as the solution to climate change. I talk about it as the solution to restoring a consistent increase in human prosperity by increasing our ability to, or by enabling us to increase our per capita energy consumption. So I talk about it as being about human prosperity and avoiding the coming global energy crisis, which I think is going to be a really serious threat to humanity. If the climate guys, want to find a solution to energy transition, I think I can offer them one. It's not my personal motive, really, is solving climate change. I think that climate change is actually the least compelling reason for energy transition. But hey, if somebody else is completely, obsessed with climate change, I want them to be my friend, not my enemy. So it's a difficult balancing act. But I think I agree with you that we don't want to contribute to climate alarmism. But I think we definitely should take advantage of the very strong will that exists as a result of a climate motivated agenda for energy transition and say, look, if you're looking for a solution to energy transition, nuclear provides it, provided that you embrace these advanced nuclear technologies and don't get stuck in the, pressurized light water reactor is the only solution, which is unfortunately the way most Western, nuclear engineering degree programs, it's kind of what they teach the kids in university, is that it's all about pressurized light water reactors. And we've got to break out of that and focus on advanced technology.
Thank you very much, Eric. We are running out of time. We're already over the 2 hours that we allocated for this space. And before I take the last question from David Shepard, I just would like to mention for those who joined us late that our sponsor is Ataka, which is the only energy-focused media in Arabic. So if you see me retweeting their tweets, again, Twitter has a translate function. So under any tweet on the left, just push that translate button, and you can see what they are talking about. There is massive amount of information in Arabic that is not available to the rest of the world. Again, we are talking about the countries that produce most of the oil. They have most of the oil. They have a lot of gas, LNG, etc. And now we are talking about nuclear. So please follow them and make sure you translate what they are publishing. So when you see me retweeting in Arabic, don't just ignore it and think we are just saying nothing. There is a lot of information to be said there. David,
Hi, can you hear me well?
we hear you well. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Anas, for hosting this superb forum. And I got to say, Eric and Justin, your contributions to this space in terms of uh, disseminating information on this topic can't be overstated. Eric, my question is a straightforward one for you. Recently, you had Mark Nelson on your podcast, and I heard it. And I have a question regarding the discussion you had around small modular reactors. Today and in previous podcasts, when you speak about the potential benefits of distribution of and proliferation of small modular reactors, you almost speak in sort of utopian tones. And it's very seductive, and I think a lot of listeners uh, have very wide eyes. But I do recall when you had that conversation with Mark, Mark pushed back on the sort of I'm not going to say viability, but he pushed back on just how, on perhaps the potential in which you described the modular reactor infrastructure build out and seemed to favor the light water reactor. Would you mind just discussing that briefly for this forum?
Sure. I
Eric,
really,
if you don't mind, Eric, please.
yeah.
Can we make it a little bit short because we are running out of time?
Sure,
Thank you.
and maybe what I'll do is at some point I'll write a Substack post or something to go further on that, or maybe we can have a follow on Spaces to talk in more detail about it. But Mark is a great guy. He's a pro-nuclear activist. He's worked very hard to help people understand the opportunity of nuclear energy. Mark and I disagree pretty strongly on both modular nuclear reactors and on advanced nuclear technology. And one place I do agree strongly with Mark is small modular reactor. It's mostly being used as a marketing term. It doesn't really have any formal definition. But if you look at specifically molten salt, thorium-fueled reactors for the sake of modularity, being able to deploy them in large scale, being able to really solve energy transition, including the fuel challenge, because the fuel challenge of providing enough uranium to do it Mark's way, so to speak. We've just got a much better answer. I think a lot of what Mark is saying is he doesn't want to see the world stop building pressurized water reactors because of the promise of something new that's coming. And I agree with him on that. We ought to be building what we can build right now. I think, though, that this topic would probably require a much longer thing. Maybe, at some point we'll do a debate with Mark on the merits of those different technologies. But Mark's a super guy. I count him as a friend, but we disagree pretty strongly on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, we are running out of time, so that leaves us out of time. And I want to thank all our speakers today for an excellent space. Basically, it will take me probably a couple of days to digest some of the information that I learned today. Please make sure you follow all of them. Before we close, I would like to ask each one of you to tell our listeners how they can learn more about your work. So let me start with Justin. Your newsletter produced almost 500% return in 4 years, which is phenomenal. For our listeners who might be interested in subscribing or knowing more about your work, etc., how they can sign up, how they can reach you, please go ahead.
Thank you, Anas, and I really appreciate you having me on today, and thanks for everybody listening. You can reach our work at uraniuminsider.com, and we write a monthly newsletter that's very in-depth. We focus a lot of our energy on the physical uranium market. We also do daily updates and monthly members-only webinars, and our 5-year anniversary coming up this summer. I appreciate you having me on, and I wish everybody a good rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thomas Jam, how can people who are interested in your technology learn more about it, learn more about the thorium fueled waste burner reactor design, and for accreditation, institutional investors who are basically interested or wanted to participate, etc. Especially if you have any capital raises, you are raising capital for the Copenhagen Atomics. So please tell us more how people can reach you and anything you want to say.
Yes, thank you first of all for having these spaces, and I enjoyed participating. Copenhagen Atomics is currently raising a round of funding. We expect to close this round roughly by 1st of April. There's still an opportunity to participate. We expect to generate 50 times return on the investment in the next 10 years. If you want to follow us, you can go to copenhagenatomics.com, our website, and sign up on our newsletter, or you can go to YouTube. We have a Copenhagen Atomics channel on YouTube where you can see a lot of different videos about what we're doing and what we're building.
Thank you very much. Eric, I don't know how to ask you this, but what business you are in today and what you are doing these days and what services you offer?
Well, in theory, Anas, I'm fully retired and not in any business. And I guess if I was a normal human being, I would be on the golf course having fun. But I'm a passionate, high energy kind of guy, and I'm not coping well with retirement. I guess I flunked retirement. So to keep my mind engaged, I produce a free podcast for professional investors. That's at macrovoices.com. Last year, I produced a free documentary series about the challenges of energy transition, which anybody can watch for free at energytransitioncrisis.org. For listeners who might want to see maybe a more graphic depiction with pictures of this nuclear Henry Ford moment that we've been talking about today, there's also a video that would make an excellent supplement to this spaces. You'll find that one at energytransitioncrisis.org/SMR, as in small modular reactor. But now I'm going to answer a question you didn't ask, which is what business I want to be in. You know, what would bring me out of retirement in a heartbeat would be the opportunity to CEO a new energy company that seizes the nuclear Henry Ford moment. But there's no way to do that unless it's in partnership with a well-funded sovereign government that's ready to invest in securing its position as a global leader in energy long beyond the age of oil. And, I'm very serious about this. I'm ready to invest my own money in it. But my ideas and my plans, they're a dead end unless there's a partnership with a sovereign government that actually has the wherewithal to pull it off. What I've realized, though, is trying to take these ideas and pitch them to a sovereign wealth fund is a non-starter. Their investment criteria are focused on well-established, proven technologies that have been used many times before and so forth. They venture into unproven, leading-edge technologies only for projects like the Burj Khalifa or NEOM, where the project itself has been identified as strategic to the country's future. And then at that point, the rules of the game are different. They welcome proposals to use revolutionary new technology like the friction piles that allow the Burj Khalifa to stand up without having a foundation anchored into bedrock. So I'm the first to admit that all my ideas are pretty darn ambitious. None of them are ever going to come to fruition unless a head of state who has Henry Ford's vision and courage to act on that vision someday recognizes this Henry Ford moment and decides to seize it. So what I do to keep myself busy during my retirement is just try to figure out what it would take to actually pull this off in case I'm someday invited to participate in helping someone to seize that Henry Ford moment, which is way bigger than I am. In the meantime, I'm trying to do more public speaking in this and doing the podcasts and so forth, and coping with retirement as best as I can.
Eric, given what you describe, what you do, no one is going to believe you that you retired.
I'm trying. I want to be.
I can tell you one thing. I am in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia right now. I'm staying here for two more weeks. And I can tell you, you look at the area here, every day there is a conference, every day there is a big event, every day there are presidents and kings and others coming from all around the world. This area is booming, and I think it is ripe for a nuclear investment. We will have more of those spaces on Sundays because that's really the easiest time for everyone to meet. So we will be in touch regarding those spaces. Thank you all for attending today. Thank you for our speakers. Thanks everyone, and thanks for Ataka for sponsoring this. Thanks for Muhammad Yusri, who's basically running this from Cairo. So thank you Ataka, and thank you everyone. You all have a great day.
Thanks, Hans.